Hello just friends, in this video we will be taking a look at the concept of key squares, the importance of key squares and how to use the key squares to our knowledge and to gain and to secure victory in our game. So here we go. Basically let's ask ourselves, what are key squares? Which squares can be called as key squares? Generally the key squares are squares which if you occupy those squares you're going to win the game. So what do I mean by that? Let's see. We have a pawn on c2. What are the key squares for the pawn on c2? Generally, those key squares are located two squares in front of the pawn. So that will be like c4, d4, b4. These are the three key squares of the pawn. If I have a white king on either of this square, occupying this square, physically occupying this square, that generally means that I'm going to secure a victory in the endgame. How to do that? Well, we'll take a look at that. We are going to use opposition in that case and we shall win the game. But we shall take a look at some examples in the later on in the video. Right now, let's see what are the key squares. So what happens if the second rank pawn reaches the third rank? Does the key squares change or they remain same? Well, they definitely change. Whenever the pawn advances, its key square changes. So what are the key squares for the pawn on c3? They are located again two squares in front of the pawn. So that will be like c5, d5 and b5. So the key squares for the pawn on c3 are c5, d5, b5. These are the three key squares. And if you have a white king on either of the square occupying the square, you will basically secure a win rather effortlessly. So what happens if the pawn reaches the fourth rank? Again, whenever the pawn advances, its key square changes. Now you have a key squares on two squares in front of the pawn, c6, d6, b6. And now something interesting is going to happen. Once the pawn reaches, it crosses the your half of the board and reaches out in the opponent's half of the board in the enemy territory, something interesting happens. The pawn grows in strength and so does its key squares. Yes, we have key squares, two squares in front of the pawn with c7, d7 and b7, but also now on c6, b6 and d6. So the number of key squares have grown from 3 to 6 and the pawn has increased in strength. It is becoming a much more threat, and having your king, white king, on any of the 6 squares will secure a victory. So the chances of white winning have increased with the advance of the pawn. Now having a pawn on the 6th rank means again 6 key squares with this and this too. So again we have 6 key squares, excellent chances of white winning the game. In general, you need to have your king occupying these key squares to secure a win. Now how to do this in practical game? Let us take a look at some examples to understand this thoroughly. Here we have our first example. This is a very critical example and very interesting one to to understand the concept of key squares. Now, if a beginner is given this position, he'll start to randomly move his king. For example, he'll try to play king d2 and after black plays something like this, king d3, just trying to randomly play that. Black will now go king d7 and this is a distant opposition and now it's basically a draw. So what do I mean by that? King d4 is answered with king d6 and king c4 answered with king c6, and in general I'm not letting you to come forward. I mean, this is an opposition and I'm going to explain you exactly why this doesn't work. Well, the thing is, the black king is stopping you from occupying the key squares. The pawn on c3 has key squares on d5, c5 and b5, and I'm not going to let you, as black, I'm not going to let you, your king, occupy the squares physically. And if I don't let you occupy those squares, you're not going to win the game. So how does this go? For example, let's see token variation for those of you who don't know. King d4, king d6. Pushing the pawn does not help because we simply play this. Here, it goes back, and whenever the king approaches forward, we just give an opposition. And this is generally a draw because the king will now be stalemated. This is a draw. Yeah, the king who wants to win the game has to be two squares in front of the pawn. So white king has to be on the key square. He needs to reach the key squares of the c3 pawn. So what are the key squares of the c3 pawn? They are d5, c5, b5, located two squares in front of the pawn. I need to reach those squares. The problem here is I simply cannot reach the key square on d5 because black is just in time to answer me. He's just in time to oppose me. So what do I do? Well, you cannot reach d5 and you cannot reach c5 maybe. But there is one more key square which you are missing out. And that is the b5 square. That is also a key square. And if white king reaches that square and occupies that square, we are still going to work. So the only way to make this work and win the game is not king to d2, but king to c2. This is the only winning move in the position. So let's see how this goes. King e7, king to b3. I'm trying to approach the b5 square, and once I get to that square, and once I occupy the square, I'm gonna win the game. So how will it go? King to d6, we have king to b4. Yes, we have discussed this. This is the diagonal position. Black has to move. If he plays king c6, I'm gonna play king c4. I'm saying it's opposition. You gotta move and you have to concede some squares. So if you go to the other side, you have given up some important squares, and I'm gonna take charge of that. So I'm going to play king to d5, and now you can see I'm occupying one of the key squares of the pawn on c3. These are the three key squares, and I'm already occupying, I'm physically occupying the square on d5, and this will basically secure me a win. What happens if the king tries to reach here? This time I'll go the b5 square, and this is also a key square of the c3 pawn, again securing a win. So let's try to see this till the end. Just for those who are new to this, we are just going to oppose him again. We are just going to stop him and say it's your move, you need to concede some squares. And if you move here, I'm going to go here, take control of some important squares like this, and this, and a variation can go like this, just for example, this, here. Do we have to worry about key squares? No longer, because the pawn has crossed the board of the first half of the board. It's in the opponent's territory, and now it has six key squares. This one, this one, this one, obviously, as well as this three. So basically we have six key squares. White king is occupying one of the key squares, so we don't have to worry it's whom to move. Doesn't really matter it's whom to move, because white will be win in any case. So king c6, here he goes, here we come, and we have controlling the three squares, and forward, and all you have to do is just push forward the pawn, c6, c7, c8. That's a queen, that's a girl, that will be a girl. So easy peasy. All you have to do is understand the key squares and then try to occupy those. So here in this case, we are not able to occupy the d5 square, but we were able to occupy the b5 square. And you try to play reach that via c2. You're taking a curve towards it. You're not taking a straight road. So remember that. And let's solve our next example now. So here comes our example, a very interesting one again. You have a pawn on g4, far advanced. And how is white going to win this game now? Now, let us not hurry, let us not be like a beginner and start to advance our king randomly. Let us be very mature, try to understand what are the key squares of the pawn on g4. The pawn on g4 has not yet crossed the chessboard. I mean, crossed the first half of the board, our half of the board, and it has still not entered the opponent's territory, which means that it is going to have only three key squares. So, which are those three key squares? Here we have two squares located in front of the pawn. So, we have g6, h6, and f6. And you can see this. White king is too far away from the f6 square, and black king can easily oppose us from trying to occupy this square. Also the g6 square. So the only square which is in our reach is the h6 square. Maybe we can try to somehow reach the h6 square, and the way to do it is not to go straight forward. If you just go like a rhino, or a dinosaur, and just march straight forward, the black king will just come in front of you and say opposition, you're not coming forward. So you have to be clever here. You have to take a curve here. So the correct way to win this one is to start with king to f2, taking a curve, taking a shortcut. So king to d6, king to g3. Remember, we are trying to reach these key squares, particularly the h6 square. That is the one we are aiming for, because that is far away from the black king and very close to us. So now we have something like king to e7, or maybe something like king e6, perhaps, trying to come closer to the pawn. King h4, king f7, and this is the point. White plays king h5. Yes, this is a diagonal opposition, and now this turns into a near opposition after white plays king g5. Basically, I am giving you the opposition. You have to move your king, and you have to concede some square. You have to give away control of some squares. So if you go this side, I'm going to come from the other side. I'm going to take charge of these squares, very important squares, and I'm securing my advance of the pawn. So how is it going to work? Let's say king here. We're just going to push forward. Now the pawn has crossed the fifth rank. It has come into the enter the opponent's territory, and its power and key squares have increased. So what are the key squares of the pawn on g5? Well, again they're located two squares in front of them. So g7, h7, f7, but also g6, h6, and f6. So we have six key squares our king is on one of the key squares and this is simply winning. So something like king g6, king over here, here, and this is like easy peasy stuff. White is just gonna push forward and win the game after promoting. Why is that a black queen? Yeah, that there we go. And this is just gonna be easy. I'm gonna finish this one with technique. And here we have the mate. There we go. So understanding key squares is very important. Just whenever you have a king and pawn ending, do not hurry. Just try to pause for a while. Try to think what are the key squares. Basically, you must occupy the key squares with your king, and that's the way you can win the game. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, so let us take a look at some exceptions, some really interesting ones. You need to know this. So let's have it. So here comes the exception, and like always, it's the unfortunate rook pawn. In most of the endgames, rook pawn are terrible, they're miserable because they have the least winning chances. Why is that so? Well, the key squares for the pawn on h2 are not located two squares forward. They are not like h4 or g4. No, they are not there. They are far above the board on g7 and g8. These are the key squares for the pawn on h2, and if the pawn is on something like a2, then the key squares will be b7 and b8. So the rook's pawn have the least amount of square key squares, and they are located like in Siberia. They are too far away from a king, and basically it's like super easy for black to make a draw. For example, let us go forward here. All black has to do is just go in the corner and wait there, and he can do whatever stuff he wants, and he can just wait in the corner. He can take a nap, he can do everything, he can just move around. Doesn't matter what white plays, doesn't matter what white does here, because you can't really bring the black king out of this corner, and that will always end in a draw. So the way to win this endgame is just somehow to, if you have your king, try to make it as advanced as possible and try to reach the g7 or g8 square. If you have your king on either of this square, g8 or g7, then maybe you can win the end games. But these are like exception ones. So that's the reason having center pawns is far better. And that's the reason center pawns are so overestimated in most of the openings. You always talk about center pawns, having center pawns. That's the reason they are so important, because they secure more winning chances than the rook's pawn or the flank pawns. So hope you have found this video instructive and learned something about the key squares. Basically, the idea is about putting your king physically occupying the squares, and then you can secure a victory, easy peasy. So thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed this. Bye.